Hi, I'm Amy Cardoso and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Meadows Museum and our interviewer Janelle Montgomery speaks with Wendy Sepponen about the exhibition Alonso Berruguete, First Sculptor of Renaissance Spain. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, we're at the Meadows Museum with Wendy Sepponen to talk about Alonso Berruguete, First Sculptor of Renaissance Spain. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Janelle.
The exhibition introduces us to Alonso Berruguete, who worked in Spain in the first half of the 16th century, shortly after the Spaniards first encountered the Americas. Why the focus on Berruguete, and how were the works for the exhibition selected and arranged for the show?
Two very good questions about which I could talk endlessly, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. Why Berruguete? You touched on a little bit why he's this fascinating figure to study, simply because he is operating in this really interesting time during Spain's history and art history. He's born around 1488. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabel successfully expel the last of the Nasrid Caliphate in the south of Spain, and for the very first time, unify all of the Spanish kingdoms. And then when he dies in 1561, Charles V has already been Holy Roman Emperor. His son Philip II has already ascended to the throne. So a very dynamic religious, political, economic time that he's living through. In terms of Berruguete as an artist, I mean, look around, there's nothing like the art that he produces. And so the exhibition is trying to really dive into what makes him so distinctive, what made him so impactful on the landscape of Spanish art history. In terms of how we chose the works that we chose, especially of his, we were very lucky to have a very wonderful working relationship with the Museo Nacional de Escultura, the National Sculpture Museum in Valladolid, Spain. And they house a huge majority of Berruguete's art that's not in situ. So they very, very generously loaned to us some of the absolute best examples of his work.
He's been called the most innovative sculptor in Spain for his time. What were some of the things that made him stand out in innovation?
Again, there's nobody who's in Spain who's designing works like Berruguete. He is someone who is synthesizing, along with his own very strong individual artistic viewpoint, a lot of sources. The Spain of his youth was deeply pan-continental. There were German artists, Italian artists, of course Spanish artists, Flemish, Northern French artists, all coming to Spain working in what we now call a Hispanoflemish style. He then goes to Italy and adds to the various lessons that he learned in his youth. He was the son of a very, very famous painter. Starts to learn all of these other lessons from classicism, from Michelangelo, from the Florentine Mannerists. He then returns to Spain and amalgamates all of those really rich influences, sources, inspirations into work that was completely distinctive at the time.
One of the works that really stood out for me in terms of his innovation is the Ecce Homo.
Yes, amazing.
This is the moment when Pontius Pilate is presenting Christ to the crowd just before the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things about that sculpture that sort of do it differently than the ones who'd come before?
So that sculpture has a particularly great claim to fame in being the earliest known sculpture by Berruguete. So it's coming from this time period in the early 1520s, around 1523. Berruguete has been back in Spain from Italy for about maybe 4 or 5 years. He comes back to Spain. No one's really interested in the kinds of paintings he seems to have really enjoyed making in Italy. And so he has to adapt very quickly to the Spanish market, which is much more interested in altarpieces, multimedia, a blend of architecture, painting, sculpture, and painted sculpture. And so he very savvily starts to align himself with sculptors who are experienced in that. For around that time, 1523, he co-signs a contract for a small church south of Valladolid where he sets up shop. And within 10 months, that sculptor dies, and he inherits the commission, the sculptor's tools, and very likely a number of his workshop. It's this really crucial time where he finally has the literal tools to make that transition from a designer who's operating more in painting to a designer who's now allowed to work in sculpture and architecture and drawing and all of these other art forms as well. So that brings us back then to the sculpture that you're asking about, the Ecce Homo, which was not made for that altarpiece that he inherits, but for a side chapel, but in that same church. So it represents then this early moment in his mature career in Spain where he can really start putting into practice all of those various sources and inspirations. We see the elongated form, this emphasis on kind of the macro more than the micro. He's not interested in fussy little vignettes of perfectly described surface detail and light and texture. He's interested in broad forms, elongated forms that are deeply impactful right away, that kind of pack an emotional punch. And so there's also something about that sculpture where you can tell he's interested in anatomy. You know, the kneecaps look right, the elbows look right, but when it's all put together in the proportions that come from his brain, it looks precarious, it looks uneasy, which actually then just feeds into the narrative importance of that moment.
Yeah, there's something about the way the Christ's limbs are crossed.
Yes.
That really makes you feel the suspense of that.
The unbalance,
Instant,
yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned that he was working also on an altarpiece at this time.
Yes.
One of the other works that caught my eye is the Saint Benedict converting the Gaul Zala.
Yes.
Completely different from an Ecce Homo.
Yes, very much so in many ways.
Kind of a relief almost,
Yes,
but
yes.
there's still this sculptural element to it, and then a
Absolutely.
horse just coming out at you from nowhere. Well, tell us more about that one.
That relief comes from what is widely considered his masterpiece of altarpieces. And it's the high altarpiece for the Benedictine monastery in Valladolid called San Benito el Real, Saint Benedict the Royal.
Yes.
It's then a relief of a scene from the life of Saint Benedict. Makes sense, very on brand, very on theme. That relief gives a really good sense of the altarpiece in terms of scale and also how he's designing segments of the altarpiece for something that is part of a larger architectural whole. The way we have it displayed here is quite low. You can get close, you can appreciate the gilding. The gilding on that brown and gold horse is one of my favorite gilded passages from the entire altarpiece. It's incredible. You know, the perspective of the buildings behind, in the background of the scene, is really kind of tipped and looks wonky. But when you account for the fact that it would have been seen from maybe 2 or 3 stories below, that amazing horse is actually doing a lot of compositional work, leading you in, welcoming you into the scene, and then the kind of tippedness of those buildings completely resolves itself in terms of the perspective. So it is an amazing relief. It is sculptural, it is pictorial in the way it's handling the relief, and he and his workshop are having fun, I think, as is evidence in that amazing horse.
And I think you see some of his painterly training
Yes.
as well in the way
Yes.
he's composed that little section.
I agree.
So one other work that I loved is the Saint Christopher that's
Yes.
behind us.
It is my favorite.
There's something about the finishes of, I mean, his hair is glossy, his skin is glowing, his clothing, such as it is, conveys all of the kind of motion and action of his life. How does that kind of finish happen? I mean, he's obviously had training as a painter, but he's not doing all of these for the altarpiece, is he?
He's not doing, there's an outstanding question when anybody starts to think about Berruguete's output and his role as a designer, almost like the head of, as the head of an architectural firm almost, versus an actual carpenter, carver, sculptor. We know he operated mostly in painting as part of his youth. So I'm glad you're isolating the St. Christopher, which has some of the most vivid and spontaneous and gestural painted finishes of any of the painted sculptures we have on view here. And you can see, you almost get the sense that it was completely finished. It was finished, gilded, polychromed, and it's almost like one of the Benedictine monks said, there's too much flesh.
Cover some of that up.
Cover him up. He hasn't, propriety, decorum, please cover him up. And Berruguete, either himself or one of his workshop members with his permission, went in and painted quickly. There's a little peekaboo moment at his proper right hip where it would have been completely exposed hip, it would have been completely exposed thigh, but he's gone in with a paintbrush and painted on extra fictive fabric to cover up the figure. So it's a wonderful example of looking closely at the painted surface when you're dealing with a designer who is painter and sculptor.
And you're thinking about St. Christopher who's walking across water.
Yes.
So the fact that the clothing has that sort of saturated, soaking wet sensation to it really fits with the story.
Absolutely.
And we're so used to monochrome sculptures, marble or bronze.
Yes.
To see all of this polychrome, it's just a delight.
Thank you. I agree, and I have to give a lot of credit also to our designer who's in Spain, Francisco Bocanegra, for doing these really amazing, for designing this amazing installation, this amazing wall color that completely pops, that makes the gold, I should say, completely pop. And I think that they are really lavish objects.
The Sacrifice of Isaac, which is in the other room, what point in Berruguete's career does this come in? It feels like it has many of the same emotional twists in terms of the construction of the sculpture as the early Ecce Homo.
Yes.
And yet some of the finishing and ways he's put it together seem to be a little further along.
Yes, it's also from the San Benito altarpiece, so that we're talking about 1526 to 1533. He goes basically from the commissions for that small church south of Valladolid, from which the Ecce Homo comes, to securing the commission for San Benito el Real, which was quite the get for someone who basically only had one altarpiece under his belt, and not even in the kind of major capital or court center. So it's coming from that same period as, say, the St. Christopher just behind me. So it has similar painted embellishments where the carved beard and the painted beard kind of diverge in really interesting ways. We usually think of painted sculptures as painting goes on the carved support and enhances the illusion of what's being represented. This is completely, the painted hand really deviates from the carved form in really interesting ways. That sculpture also, we tried to install as many sculptures as possible in the round to try to get visitors to question, how are these things made? And when you look at the backs of these sculptures, it betrays a kind of improvisational, almost experimental approach to carving and making these sculptures.
Because it looks like they're not out of a single block of wood.
They are not.
It looks like they're assembled. That's not age-related cracking.
No,
that's how
no, that is original to how they were working in the workshop. So there were even times in both the Saint, as is evidence in both the Saint Christopher and the Sacrifice of Isaac, where you get the feeling that Berruguete wasn't totally happy with the design, with the composition, with the emotional impact, with the movement and emotion. And there are passages where we have them displayed this way, where you can see that someone in the workshop dipped cloth in gesso or glue and modeled the cloth on the form. And you can see this particularly well from the back of the St. Christopher. You can see a little bit on a piece of fabric that's kind of drapery that's blowing in the wind off of Abraham's, what would that be, right hip, where you can see the cloth, the warp and the weft of the textile. But from the front, it's homogenized, it's polychromed, it's painted, it's treated in a way that completely obscures the fact that he's using both assembled wood and also almost rags.
Yeah, you could not tell that they're assembled wood from the front, except for the occasional little crack.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
that was
Janelle.
Really fun.
I had a fun time too. Thank you.
We want to thank Wendy for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to meadowsmuseumdallas.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching. Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.